Welcome to B2B Marketers on a Mission, a podcast for B2B marketers that helps you to question the conventional, think differently, disrupt your industry, and take your marketing to new heights. Each week, we talk to B2B marketing experts who share inspirational stories, discuss their thoughts on trending topics, and provide useful marketing tips and recommendations. And now, here's your host and co-founder of Einblick Consulting, Christian Klepp.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the B2B Marketers on a Mission podcast, where you get your weekly dose of B2B marketing insights. This is your host, Christian Klepp, and today I'm joined by someone who is on a mission to rehumanize your business through human-centered communication. So coming to us from Colorado Springs, Colorado, Mr. Ethan Beute. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Enjoyed all of our conversations leading up to this recorded one, and I'm looking forward to this one too.
Likewise, Ethan. Really looking forward to this discussion. And before I continue, look what landed on my lap. Boom.
Nice.
I would ask you for an autograph, but under the circumstances, I'll just show it to you virtually.
Okay.
Ethan, let's start this conversation with a topic that you've been passionately advocating for years, and I mentioned it in the intro. Rehumanizing your business through human-centered communication. So just from what you've seen out there, your own personal experience, especially with B2B marketing, where did we go wrong, and how will this approach help us to improve our relationships with people, not just professionally, but personally as well?
Sure. I guess I'll take it all the way back. So you blended two titles of two books that I've co-authored, Rehumanize Your Business and Human-Centered Communication in that setup. And so I'm gonna go with Rehumanize Your Business first. I think we've somehow normalized over the past 30 years that we are perfectly comfortable and confident relegating some of our most important and valuable messages to a form of communication that doesn't differentiate us, doesn't build trust and rapport, and doesn't communicate nearly as well as when we look each other in the eye, even if it's through a camera lens. And so by that, I mean faceless typed out text. We rely on it in so many forms. We're spending more and more time in digital, virtual, and online spaces. That's going to happen more in the future, not less. Pandemic accelerated it like it accelerated so many things, but it was already happening and it's inevitable. And the problem is that so much of this digital communication is both visually and emotionally impoverished. And in that way, it's missing what humans need and want most from one another. And so if this starts to sound soft, then I'll say, this starts to make trust harder to build. It makes trust more fragile. It makes it more difficult to understand the single most important thing that people want to understand from us, which is our intent. And I'll just spend a minute on that and give it back to you. We're asking people all day, every day to say yes to something. It could be a micro yes, it could be a macro yes. A macro yes in a B2B context is probably a signed contract or something like that. In a B2C space, it's a swiped credit card or, keying in, or some of the faster stuff we have like Shop Pay and some other thing like, yes, I will make this transaction or make this purchase. But again, going back to B2B, it could be a renewal, it could be an expansion, it could be, all these things that we need and want, or it could be the micro yeses. Yes, I'll return this phone call. Yes, I'll reply to your email. Yes, I'll make that personal introduction. Yes, I'll give you that piece of data that you need. Yes, I will speak of you positively to the other influencers of this decision that you don't know exist because you've only met with me inside my company or my account, I guess, to use it in the seller's language. So we need these yeses, big and small. And to say yes, people are judging our intent even more, and certainly before they're judging exactly what we're putting in front of them. And by intent, I mean, do you seem to believe what you're saying? Do you seem to have my best interest in mind? These things that, colloquially we say, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's what we're talking about here. And when I can't see you, when I can't hear you, when I don't know what it's like, when I can't experience you in some way, then I'm missing a lot of that intent information. It makes it more difficult to proceed. And if people aren't proceeding on the small stuff, it becomes very, very difficult to have them proceed on the large stuff. And so I guess that's the rehumanize piece is, let's look back at how business was done 100, 200, 500 years ago. It was a lot more direct. It was a lot more human. It was a lot more face-to-face. It was a lot more intimate. It was conducted in human voices, not corporate voices. And so to rehumanize is to use today's technology, specifically video is what we spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, teaching, in order to restore what's missing from the B2B buying and selling experience.
Absolutely. Just give me a second there. Like you unpacked a lot in those past couple of minutes, and it's dynamite stuff.
I'm just raring to go on this.
No, you're clearly on fire, and I love it. I love it. You said something. I wanted to go back to it. Visually and emotionally impoverished, and I think that is something clearly with a lot of deep meaning there, and that's clearly something that's you can see that a lot of companies have gone awry, especially with their the way that they do outreach, the way that they do prospecting. I got one this morning where the guy jumped straight into a pitch just as I accepted his connection request, where he just immediately says, well, are you doing this and this and this and this and this? Would you consider using my app? And I'm like, well, hang on a second, pal. You don't even know who I am, right? Yeah. Who are you? What do you do? Like, get to know me a little bit first. And I think that's going back to your point, right? Like, people are so caught up with playing the numbers game, hitting those sales quotas, right? That they make that, and I'm sure you see it that way too. They make this excuse that they do not have the time or the capacity to build relationships online, right? And I would argue, and I'm sure you argue that as well, that that's an important step that they should not be skipping.
Yeah, I think to tie that back to your original question too, I mean, I would say a lot of this, in general, I would characterize, if I had to summarize what you just shared, I would say it's this bias toward efficiency with a blindness to effectiveness, right? And this happens all the time. And I get it. And this kind of goes back to where we maybe went wrong a little bit. And by that, I don't mean we should stop doing X and start doing Y exclusively. I mean, let's restore the balance. I mean, the second book that I co-authored with my longtime friend and team member and our CMO at BombBomb, Steve Passanelli, is called Human-Centered Communication. We're calling for a restoration of this balance toward what people need and want, what's best for other people, because what's best for other people, whether they're recruits, strategic partners, suppliers, vendors, customers, prospects, et cetera, what's best for other people is actually what's best for our business. And so let's pay a little bit more attention to the effectiveness piece. What is actually working and what isn't? Not just what can we do lots of and turn into money at a 0.75% rate, And I think a lot of that, to go back to your first question again, is takes root in the Industrial Revolution, which we're only 200 years out of the onset of, so we're still in its shadow. Henry Ford's assembly line is only 100 years old, 110 or so. And what we had there was this, we started to become enamored of what we could measure, what gets measured gets done, and all these other things that are now just kind of normal standard things. That was truly when people became cogs in the machine, like in a very literal sense. And we started to interact with these machines and try to figure out, like, what's the appropriate role for humans? What's the appropriate role for the machines? We're obviously still in that mix, even though the machines have changed and people have changed too. It still becomes this very old problem. And so you start thinking about maybe a business development rep or a sales development rep who's like, every single day, I need you to give me 125 of these, 75 of these, 50 of those, and a better result in, 25 of those. They're set up in these systems and these processes that are dehumanizing to them, that are dehumanizing to the people on the other end. And we wonder why, we're not generating the appointments or the revenue that we want to. And B, we wonder why people are leaving and asking about promotions and changing to other departments and things like this. It's like, there's this really strong bias toward efficiency that is tied to a scaled industrial mass mindset, mass production, mass marketing type scenario. And the answer, if we are to move forward and to put people in their best place and to put tools and technology in their best place in relationship to one another and in relationship to the reasons we're even entertaining any of this commercial activity at all, is to find a more appropriate balance that takes a look at effectiveness and efficiency somewhat equally. And we'll probably get into another layer of why.
Absolutely, absolutely. It almost sounds similar to something that you mentioned in the book about cause and consequence. And I'm glad you brought that up because that was such a beautiful segue into the next question, which is surprise, it is about cause and consequence. Talk to us about that a little bit, like, the cause and consequences of digital pollution and what needs to be done to address these. And let's appreciate that, there's a lot of things out there, but just maybe you could summarize it a bit for us.
Sure. Yeah. So the subtitle of the book is A Business Case Against Digital Pollution. And Steve defined digital pollution as we were in the process of this. He did a much better job making it super concise than I tend to make things. And he calls them unwelcome digital distractions. So unwelcome. I didn't ask for this. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why it's in front of me. I'm not pleased by it. Digital, of course, we're talking about digital, virtual, and online experiences for the most part. And distractions, it's taking me away from what I really need and want to do. So when we think about our potential in B2B sales and marketing motions to create what someone is going to receive as digital pollution, the likelihood, the way we're doing it on average right now is pretty high. And we need to think, and if we're honest with ourselves, we're saying, well, okay, if I can do 1,000 of these and convert it at 3% in order to convert that in at 2%, so now we're talking about 2% of 3% of some number. Why wouldn't I just put a couple more zeros behind that number? Because I can get the data, I can get the list, I can send the emails, I can run the ads, whatever. And I think we lose sight of the counter effects of that pursuit, which is it's easier to block and delete you than it was before. With a tool like Superhuman, I can block an entire domain from ever hitting my inbox again, not just an individual email address. Almost anyone using email can, block an email address and say, spam, abuse, never let me get an email from this person again or from this email address again. We can now block entire domains. So if you have one rep running a sanctioned or unsanctioned, slightly overzealous campaign, and you get the wrong person on the wrong day, and they're like, enough of this, that person is dead to your entire domain, your entire company for all time. And so, which is to say nothing of blocking and deleting, reporting ads and turning those things off. And so it's not just a matter of, we're only doing this at 3%. I wish we were doing it at 4%. We're ignoring the 96 or 97% failure rate in that scenario. And certainly nothing we're going to do is ever going to get to 100%. But if we act like the 96 and 97 doesn't matter, then we're ignoring negative word of mouth. We're ignoring our own active shrinking of our addressable market by getting ignored, deleted, and blocked. And certainly that becomes a greater risk because it's easier than ever to make noise. We regard digital noise as benign. It's just, relatively speaking, I mean, it's obviously frustrating, but it's just like the sheer volume of things. We say pollution is in this category where the recipient in the moment, contextually relevant, deems this to be unwelcome and distracting, and is probably going to behave in a way that is going to create a negative effect for your business that you're not paying any attention to. And so whether it's intentional, whether it's just incidental, or whether it's in this largest category of kind of consequential pollution, something about the way we're going to market is creating this negative experience for other people. We just need to be aware of it. We need to be talking about it. We need to be thinking about it because it is, not everyone is going to market with a B2C play that's where we can say, well, we have a TAM of 1.6 billion people. Like some people I know are have a TAM of 500 companies, and so you think about some of the negative effects we're potentially creating there, and it really is highly consequential to our future.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I love the way that you broke that down so beautifully and explained that. That in itself, at least for me, is a strong case for those trying to play the numbers game to stop doing that. To stop doing it, and if I were to use another analogy or another comparison, it's almost like going on a first date and just completely blowing that, right? The chances of you getting a second date are probably like close to zero. And I would argue it's the same in the business world to a certain degree.
Yeah. And just to walk that out one more step, it's like, if someone is listening to this right now, they go, oh, it's really not quite like a first date because I've got this thing. And even if they don't love me, they need to talk to me again because I've got this thing. I'm like, well, you know what? So do other people. Customers are in control. We all know this. This is an information symmetry issue. It's a customer word of mouth and megaphone situation. It's a negative or positive review situation. So customers are in control. There's more competition than ever. The one exception I'll say, if someone is listening and they're in like a very high barrier to entry market, like, I don't know, some sectors of aerospace maybe, or biotech or something like that. But in general, most of us are facing a hyper competitive situation. And then, of course, we have product parity. And so your widget may do things that the other widgets or your service or your platform or your whatever may do something slightly different than other services. But a competitor can knock that off in a matter of months or weeks or sometimes even days. B, it may not be the most important thing. It might not be as important as you think to other people. And then C, it takes a lot, like a great deal of commitment to understand the nuances and the differences in any complex sale. Some of it is still a leap of faith. You're never going to get every question answered. You're never going to get every doubt removed. You're never going to mitigate every single risk. People are making these decisions in large part based on trust and relationship. And so this idea that they need my thing, even if I'm kind of a jerk about it, or even if they don't like me personally, I think you're underplaying all of that, the dynamics in here, especially in a more complex B2B sale.
Absolutely. And, going back to what you said about the trust and relationships, right? And about building that credibility online. And I'm sure you've read some of these reports too, Ethan. Like there was one that Gartner released about a year or so ago about the B2B buyer's journey. And not entirely surprising for me, still interesting to see. 17% of B2B buyers will talk directly to the vendor. So that means they're probably not going to do that until they've independently verified, conducted their own online research to see whether this vendor even fits the requirements that they're looking for, right? And then they might go and talk to that vendor, maybe, right?
Yeah, and then you're seeking to validate more than anything.
Absolutely. So you brought up some of these already in the past couple of minutes, but talk to us about what steps we can take to stop digital pollution.
Sure. So in general, so it's funny, Rehumanize Your Business is a book that I just started writing on my own. It was based on, I think, my first 7 years of helping pioneer this movement toward video, email, and video messaging. And it's really a guidebook, kind of what, why, who, when, and how of video, email, and video messages. Human-centered communication was Steve's idea, and he laid out some of these truths that we've already acknowledged here, that we're going to be doing more work digitally, virtually, and online in the future, not less. It's typically sales and service in the broadest definition. These environments are noisy and polluted. The tools that we're using most often have some deficiencies or some impoverishment. And so how can we help people in light of those facts? And so we roped in a bunch of our other expert friends, and our goal in doing all of this was just like an open pursuit, research, conversation, a lot of reflection on what kind of framework can we create that would be helpful in this situation? And then how do we hang some very specific strategies and tactics into it so that people could leave this experience of, reviewing the book, or reading it all the way through, start to finish. How can we leave them with something that will be useful to them? And so the framework we came up with, we titled Human-Centered Communication. And what we're doing is blending a 30 or 40-year-old practice, human-centered design, with our daily digital communication. And so I'll just give you one pass on human-centered design and how it relates to our daily digital communication to have us start thinking about, so where do we go from here? Besides some of the mindset shift that you and I have already talked about with this kind of effectiveness versus efficiency and, thinking more about how we make people feel. Do we feel like we want to go on a second date type scenario? And so human-centered design, that probably the world's foremost practitioner, adherent, proponent is a design firm called IDEO. And so I'll just speak to their one of their simplest and best models of it. They've used human-centered design for a variety of products, services, systems, and processes over the years. They designed the first Apple mouse decades ago using human-centered design principles. That was more of a physical, ergonomic, like how big is the average human hand? Like how should it move? These types of things. What is the shoulder rotation going to be like? So that was a very practical and physical and ergonomic exercise, but they used human-centered design to undertake it. But more recently, they've designed water systems in Africa. Obviously, a much more complex situation that isn't a physical ergonomic thing, is much more systematic, cultural, practical, technical, et cetera. So you can apply this to anything. So we're just applying these principles to digital communication in order to be more effective. And so the three components of a human-centered design are desirability, what people need and want; feasibility, what technology allows us to do; and viability, the definitions of business success. What does the business need? And so, I would generally argue that you could undertake a human-centered design on moral or altruistic grounds. It's just the right thing to do. It values other people. But the system doesn't, the design principles don't even ask you to do that. It does have viability as 1/3 of the decision. The trick is you need to start with desirability. What do the people involved in this product, service, system, or process, not just those creating it, not just those buying it, but everyone affected by it, stakeholders is the way we describe that currently. When we think about the stakeholders, what do they need and want? What are their needs, wants, and interests? And when we consider those first and then go to the way we apply technology and integrate that with our definitions of business success, how can we make this financially viable? Then we're in a much better position to make something that works, because of what works for people results in business success. Whereas where we so often start is, okay, let's start with business viability. How much revenue do we need? Or how many registrants do we need? Or how many appointments do we want? Or how many attendees do we need? Or, these types of things. And then we go to, what does technology allow us to do? And we typically stop there. And people have long said that marketers ruin everything. And they will. They have, kind of. This is fun to say because it's partly true, as all good humor has some truth in it. But I think we can also acknowledge with a lot of the cadence tools, that sales automation tools, let's just generically call them, that salespeople can ruin everything too. And so when you put all that together, when you start with what do we need and want as a business, and then immediately go to what does technology allow us to do, it's cheaper and more powerful than ever. You wind up with this formula for playing the numbers game, treating people like numbers rather than as people, and settling for, small conversion rates. Now you can still do it viably because that's where you started, but it doesn't value people, the people executing it, the people receiving it, and all the other people involved in it, in a way that makes it truly sustainable over the long term. And that's why you see, last thing, just want to make this relatable because I know I can get really theoretical. I'm making these numbers up. I'm not quite you did a nice job like hitting that Gartner survey very specifically, but we used to say something like, oh, it takes 7 touches in order to get someone's attention or to provoke a reply or whatever. And then it was like, now it takes 15 touches in order to get someone's, and then let's keep going here. Like, what is it now? 5 years from now, it takes 72 touches to blah, blah, like that's just not possible. That's why we have the systems and algorithms filtering what we see, sorting things for us, prioritizing messages, et cetera, et cetera. Like the machines are going to have to help us in the face of all this noise. And so the real question about pollution is, do you want to be the thing that when robots are judging, when this person reaches out to that person, do we generally get a favorable positive signal or a negative one? Because the favorable signals are the ones that are going to go to the top. Do you want to be on the top of the list or the bottom of the list, or maybe even excluded from the list altogether? That is the pollution conversation. And it's anchored in, are we thinking about what the people on the receiving end, as well as the executing end, what are their needs, wants, and interests? And that's what human-centered design calls us to do.
Give me a second to catch my breath here. But I will, well, first of all, thanks for sharing that. Secondly, let me go back to your last point. It reminds me about a piece, well, it was, you could either look at it as a piece of advice or a question that a former employer of mine asked us in a team meeting many, many years ago. He said, do you want to be part of the solution or do you want to be part of the problem? Right? And going back to what you were saying earlier, with regards to digital pollution, a lot of these people just get caught in the fray. They eventually become part of the bigger problem. Whereas they're probably going out there mostly with good intentions. I don't know, needs to be verified. Right? Secondly, yeah, IDEO. Great company. We talked about that, their book, Creative Confidence, right? And I loved reading that as well. Also talking about, design principles, and, you brought up desirability, feasibility, viability, and something that IDEO advocates, and I'm sure you do as well, is like testing everything, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to test it and have quantifiable results. We'll talk about that in a second. But to continuously iterate as you go along, because I think the problem also, especially when it comes to B2B marketing, there's many of us that we're just over planning all the time, right? We're just spending way too much time planning, right? And simulating all these scenarios. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but if that's the only thing you do, and then you focus less time and energy on actually implementing some of that stuff, right? That's where it can get a bit hairy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's highly iterative. It is about feedback. It is about conversation. It is about customer listening. And the nice thing is we have a lot of tools available to us. The one tool that I don't think we use often enough is a telephone or Zoom and actually talking with real customers. But there is something too in, having those conversations up front in the design process. What is this message, campaign, product, service? Like, what experience are we seeking to create? What do people really need and want here? What have we tried in the past that didn't work? Let's ask customers about that, or prospects or employees or whatever. And then we can use, like in the iterative process, we can start moving more toward signals rather than conversations. But I think conversations somehow always wind up at the end of the line, because it's, for folks who are listening and not watching, like I'm air quoting, it's like, it's unscalable. And again, this gets to this effectiveness thing. It's like, there's something missing from our data in general, and that is context. And a real conversation or a set of conversations is the only way to get that context. And sometimes we lead with the numbers to create hypotheses that then we validate or kind of tweak or dial in through conversation. And sometimes something is revealed in conversation, or as a pattern, let's say across 8 or 18 or 82 conversations, that then we can go look at the data differently and see, does the data bear this out? Did these 18 people that we talked to, where this theme kind of emerged, does the data support that? And so it can go one or the other, but like this conversation piece, I think, is missing in general. And it is an iterative journey, to your point.
Absolutely. You know what? You just got me thinking about another question now as you were talking. I know we wanted to save all the metrics and all that kind of fun stuff for later on, but like, what's your take on how much focus and energy you should spend on qualitative versus quantitative results and findings? Like, so all this like dark social stuff, for example, or like messages that you get on LinkedIn, right? Or conversations in the Slack channel where people are singing praises for, not necessarily the product or the service, but the person, the individual, and ultimately the company.
Yeah, in general, I would say this is a balance question. And I think if we were to balance qualitative and quantitative, then we would be spending a lot more time focused on qualitative feedback than we are today. And I just say that because the fastest, easiest, most powerful thing is to go into large volumes of quantitative feedback and draw conclusions from them. And to your point, and again, in the spirit of balance, that is perfectly helpful, but it's missing color, context, flavor. That's why marketing attribution, like, it's still regarded as a holy grail. And we still say like first touch, last touch, or some formula that weights these things differently, given different things. Like, and that alone, just the idea of attribution being as challenging as it is, I offer that just that it's a relatable example of the fact that the data doesn't have all the answers. If it did, then we wouldn't need qualitative feedback. But, right now it's a little bit of both. And so I think of quantitative as a lot of the what, and I think of the qualitative as a lot of the why. There can be flaws in both types of data. Sometimes when the way we ask a question to somebody and listen to their response, like it was a leading question, or, it took an option off the table, or we're relying on someone's memory about something that happened 6 hours or 6 days or 6 months ago. And people's memories are notoriously faulty. And so there's an art and a science to working with both types of data. And I think pursuing both from both perspectives is really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you're right to say that, whether you're talking about qualitative or quantitative, they both have their flaws. They both don't have all the answers. In an ideal world, you should use both. In reality, many tend to use one and not the latter, right? So now we get to the point in the conversation where we're talking about actionable tips, right? And recommendations. And let's appreciate, and let me just set this up for a second here. Let's appreciate that the things that you're talking about, they don't all happen overnight, right? This isn't an app you can download and boom, here we go, right? But what are some small steps that B2B marketers can take, right? That helps them to humanize, or to quote your book, rehumanize the approach and break through all this digital noise out there?
Sure. I guess it's as simple as this, and this is going to sound elementary or intuitive to a lot of people. And to those that it does, what I'm about to say does come across that way, I would say make it a commitment then, not just a first step, because I would assume it sounds elementary to you because you're already doing this sometimes. It's just now let's operationalize it and make it a true commitment. And it's as simple as this. It's asking what's in it for them. This is that first step, starting with desirability, like what's in it for them. So often, so I've been teaching, coaching, selling video email and video messaging for a decade. And so often I'll hear people ask questions like, why didn't they open my email? Or why didn't they play my video? Or, why didn't they reply? And that's better than not asking the question. It does have some curiosity baked in, but it's backward looking. It's looking at what already happened, and it's really about you and what you wanted out of it. And so bonus points for asking, but there's a better way to ask that. And it's to make it forward looking. It's to do it on the front end and stop asking about why you didn't get what you wanted out of it. Instead, what's in it for them? It's just that easy. If you ask what's in it for them, why would they open this email? Why would she play this video? Why would he make that personal introduction? If you just stop and think about what's in it for the other person or the other people, and then write a subject line around that, write an opening line around that, record a video message around that, open the conversation around that. If you're clear, if you're very clear about what's in it for the other people, then everything else is going to flow better in terms of creating a message or a campaign or an experience. And I think it's funny, I was talking to my wife, she's not in sales or marketing. She's not in technology. She's in a trust-based, relationship-based business. But, when I was describing human-centered communication to her, she was like, doesn't everyone do this? I'm like, no. You are truly one of the most empathetic people I know, and it's your default. But for a lot of us, even if that's how we are in our personal lives to some degree, we somehow we take our seat inside this machine and we put on the hat, the marketer hat or the business development hat or the, whatever. And we behave in ways that are sometimes counterintuitive to the human impulse. And I think asking what's in it for the other person is as simple as it gets. And I think the more often we can ask that, the better off we are. I think second layer, we've already talked about more customer conversations, more validation with like more color and nuance than just, congratulations, we moved the number from 2.6 to 3.0. Amazing. That's a lift. Good job. But, let's talk about the 97%.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And just on the topic of like metrics, and I know we've covered some of this already, but like, is there anything that else you wanted to add in terms of like what B2B marketers should be paying attention to? Because again, let's appreciate that not everything needs to be measured, at least not in quantitative format.
Yeah, I mean, this is an approach. It's a style. It's a workflow. It's a mindset. It's a framework. It's how we show up on our Zoom calls. It's how we compose our messages. It's how we set the tone. So, I mean, really, any of the numbers that you regard as valuable upstream precursors to the ultimate number, revenue, I don't think you need to throw any of those out. I think if you take on this approach, and I'll take a quick sidestep here. So I host the Customer Experience Podcast. I'm preparing episode 200 right now as we record this. So, wow. and I've asked every guest to define customer experience, which some of those are self episodes. So let's just say I've asked that question now to 170 sales, marketing, and customer success leaders, primarily B2B, although not exclusively. A lot of technology, but not exclusively. And, what I'm looking to do there is to see where do the answers converge, where do they diverge, and what is the truth at the center of, 150, 170 different people, as to what customer experience is. And it comes down to the mechanical side and then the emotional side or the human side. But the essence of customer experience, in my observation, is how we make people feel. How do we make people feel about themselves? How do we make people feel about their problem or opportunity? How do we make them feel about us as individual human beings? How do we make them feel about our team or our brand or our product or our service? And the reason that's important, and this ties, I was thinking about this actually earlier in our conversation, and it's just coming out now, is that like, I think we overlook the feelings because they're hard to capture and characterize. That's why there's potentially some flaws in the way we go about collecting or even processing qualitative data, is that we take people at their literal word. But, feelings beget thoughts. Some of those thoughts are conscious. Some of those thoughts are subconscious. In both cases, those thoughts guide our behavior. The conscious ones turn into online reviews and word of mouth, positive or negative or otherwise. The subconscious thoughts that come from our feelings guide the vast majority of our decisions. And so I think most people would agree that we are emotional creatures who rationalize our decisions. We make decisions emotionally, and then we rationalize them afterward. There's a great, great, great deal of science over the last 100 to 200 years in support of this. And so this idea that we would overlook how we're making people feel as we try to engage them with a variety of different touch points across a customer journey or a buyer's journey, or even, frankly, for that matter, employee and recruiting, that experience as well. I think if we think about what's in it for other people, they're made to feel a little bit more seen, a little bit more understood, a little bit more appreciated. And it's easier in that context to move forward. When you've, shut down a phone call or shut down a Zoom call or shut down a chat on a website and said, these people just don't get me, or I am done, or whatever the case may be. Likewise, you said, oh my God, that was just the best. That was so much faster or easier or better than I expected. And so much of that is in understanding our prospects and our customers, anticipating their needs and wants a little bit and playing into them. And I don't mean that in a manipulative way. It's just like, I spent the time and energy up front to see you and understand you. I still have come with some discovery questions so I can dial into that even further. But the more we can create that feeling of being seen, heard, understood, appreciated, valued, as early and as often as possible, the better off we are, period. And what the challenge in all of this, to go back to your question, the challenge in all of this is that there is no metric for that. it shows up in all the other metrics. It shows up in the conversions. It shows up in the show rates. It shows up in it shows up in all the metrics.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I just wanted to pull out these two little anecdotes, right, just to drive that point home again. And I think, I'm sure it's the same in the United States, but over here in Canada, there's a lot of AI going around, especially with banks, right? So you've got a problem with your card, or you have an inquiry regarding your bank account, and you call up the hotline, and the first thing they do is they push you into this 15-minute like pre-recorded like message sequence, and you dial on one for this and you dial on two for that, and by the time you actually get to a human being, it might even be 30 minutes, right? And I've had that experience with one bank here. I'm not going to say who it is, but it just completely drove me nuts, right? And then I had an issue with my PayPal account, and yeah, they pushed me into that sequence as well, but it didn't take quite that long. And I actually got on a call with the customer service representative, and that this person was so focused on finding out what the problem was and reaching that solution ASAP, as opposed to like, okay, asking like 100,000 questions, right? And that's going back to your point, right? That's probably also a topic for another podcast episode, right? Like when is the right time and the wrong time to be using automation? But case in point, right? How you make people feel at the end of the day. Do you want them to end that call frustrated, telling themselves, I'm never going to bank with this institution again? Or do you want them to leave saying, wow, this person really cared about me?
Yep.
Right. Okay. So we get to a question where you can get up in your soapbox, but a status quo that you passionately disagree with, and why?
This is such a good one. And I mean, I get there are a lot of directions I could go. I feel like I've soapboxed on plenty of stuff, and thanks for teeing me up for that. I guess the one I'll go to, I feel like everyone is calling every number besides revenue a vanity metric. So that's it. The status quo is calling. I'm saying it is status quo to overuse the term vanity metric, and to discard potentially useful pieces of information as vanity metrics, and really saying like all that matters is revenue. It's true that revenue is the number that matters. I would argue profitable revenue matters even more than revenue in general. But and so what happens there is that, like, if someone is offering a metric, there's a really good conversation to be had there. If your gut reaction is this is vanity, it's like, okay, so you shared this with me. You shared the shift from month to month and year to year. Why do you think that's important? What is the downstream consequence? Like, there's a conversation to be had there, and it may result in either A, greater appreciation of that metric that you first discarded as vanity, and or B, it could result in that person having a learning moment where they're going to maybe change what they're paying more attention to. And again, I would just go back to the pass on kind of attribution, and it's just messy. Anyone that knows exactly why a dollar got produced or reproduced, or exactly why a dollar turned into $1.72 on contract renewal, anyone who knows exactly why that happened, congratulations. Most people don't, and it's a big messy process. And I'm not just going to throw something away as a vanity metric until we have a good conversation about it.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And I think it's going back to what you said earlier on in the conversation. People are so obsessed with measuring everything, right? That sometimes you get lost in, to your point, what has priority and what's just fluff, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to be fair, there are vanity metrics.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm not disputing that at all.
No. In fact, I'm reacting to your observation there, because you're right. Some people track 85 things when there really are only like 5 to 15 levers that really matter right now.
Yes.
And if you want to get that sub team that's responsible for delivering those 2 of the 5 key numbers, maybe needs to know what are a couple upstream measures so that we can forecast this correctly, which ones are positively correlated with, the outcome that we're seeking. And so there should be a couple of numbers behind each number, but a big board that has 85 numbers on it is just not that useful.
Correct. And I know that our conversation is not about data. I mean, it's like human-centered communication, but if we are going to talk about data, what is the story? What story are you trying to tell with this data, right? And
who's the audience?
Correct.
Because you're going to tell the exact same story differently to different audiences. That's why we have executive summaries to everything that we produce. The executive wants the summarized version, but the frontline team that's most responsible for this thing needs all the details and the twists and the turns and the backstory and the context. And so it's telling the story well and telling the story well for the right audience.
Absolutely. Ethan, as expected, this was such an incredibly informative and insightful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And a quick intro to yourself and how folks out there can get in touch with you.
Sure. Again, my name is Ethan Beute. Last name is spelled Beute. You can find me on every social network as Ethan Beute. LinkedIn's probably the best place to start. My title is Chief Evangelist at BombBomb, software company based in Colorado Springs, as you were kind enough to mention off the top. I've already mentioned we're about video, email, and video messaging. And I've co-authored 2 books with my friend Steve Passanelli. They are Rehumanize Your Business and Human-Centered Communication. You can learn more about both of those at bombbomb.com/book. It's just the word bomb twice, bomb.com/book. And this has been super fun. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate the opportunity.
It was an absolute pleasure. And not to sound too biased, but it really is worth a read, guys. So do grab a copy when you can. Ethan, once again, thank you so much for your time. Take care, stay safe, and talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Thanks. Thank you.